Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into how the media is banned from Gaza. Let's get started. Welcome to the first episode of Season 4 of the Jewish Diaspora Report. For this week's episode, I wanted to look into something that's been an ongoing issue for the last pretty much year since the war in Gaza began. And as always, I want to give you some background information to sort of explain what's been going on for a very long time, the historical issues, but also why it affects current events today. And on this week's episode, I want to look into the media in Gaza, or frankly, the media being banned from Gaza. Many of you who haven't listened to this podcast much or maybe are new to the issue in Gaza, you might be a little surprised to hear there's no media in Gaza because we hear about it all the time. If you turn on CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, all of these organizations seem to have plenty of news coverage coming from Gaza. So how is that possible if there is no media in Gaza? And for those of you who have listened to this podcast many times before, we have discussed that any media in Gaza are locals because there is no media allowed. And therefore, people who are local are paid by big name media companies like CNN, MSNBC, Associated Press, Al Jazeera. And these locals get footage on whatever cameras and phones they have and do reports. So anything you are hearing on mainstream media, or most media at this point, is from one of those sources, which means a local person who is not really a reporter. They call themselves a reporter. They put on a press vest, but by no means are they a legitimate, third-party, unaffected, unattached person giving you the clear facts and an unbiased opinion. These are local people who obviously have some skin in the game, giving their opinions and their slanted story. It isn't an unfair criticism to suggest that Israel should allow unbiased, third-party, unaffiliated people into the Gaza area in order to report the quote-unquote facts. I have been hearing this pretty much since the beginning of the war. And not that you really need to hear this, but here's a short montage of Piers Morgan, a journalist himself, claiming that it's Israel's fault for not allowing these journalists in. And what would they be hiding? Why aren't they letting journalists in? So when we listen to this clip, it's just a montage of various times he's asked on his show to typically Israeli people. We'll come back on the other side and we'll discuss why it is that Israel isn't letting the media in.
One of my big problems with Israel and the IDF is they haven't let journalists go in and verify anything that they're doing. What if actually war crimes have been committed on quite a wholesale basis? You seem to be absolutely certain that there's no war crime that's been committed. But how can you be certain? Again, we come back to the media being banned from going in there. If you don't let the media in, then I'm afraid as a journalist, I'm like, Piers, what are they hiding?
To be fair, I give Piers Morgan credit. I don't blame him for this type of statement. He's not exactly wrong in this idea that we need third-party and independent people. A lot of people, for whatever reason, don't like to accept anything the IDF says. And on the other hand, we don't take anything that Hamas says as true. So therefore, a third party could solve this issue. So why is it that Israel is refusing to allow international journalists into Gaza? The most obvious answer to this, and on its face, the most clear reason why you wouldn't let third parties in, would be because it is a war zone. It is absolutely dangerous. So letting international film crews going around, wandering the streets, not knowing who is part of the media and who isn't, is a slightly dangerous idea. Not only for the soldiers who are looking at a bunch of people in a crowd and not knowing what they're doing, but also for the journalists themselves. Think about the challenge and difficulty for the IDF to try and locate hundreds of journalists around the Gaza area, trying to call CNN and ABC and then call someone else from Fox News to find out, where are you? Are you in this area? Are you in that area? It is a very dangerous situation, not to mention adding the complexity of trying to locate all of these people before doing pretty much any strike in Gaza. And a fair point you could make if you wanted to make it, would be, well, isn't there media in all war zones? Isn't there some in Ukraine right now documenting what's going on? Which is a fair point. Most of the times they're not exactly on the front lines per se. They're usually accompanied by army people who have cleared the area to make sure they are not in imminent danger. They are not just wandering around willy-nilly where the army doesn't know where they are for future strikes. But the other main reason is the fact that usually most armies, legitimate armies, don't attack the press, even if accidents do happen sometimes. It's unintentional. But in Gaza, there is a slight difference. The problem with Gaza is the fact that we are not fighting an army that is going to abide by international law and rules and ethics. We will find, after not too long, Hamas not only using these people as human shields, as they do their own people and their own children, but we will see them use these groups for their advantage because they don't care about the international journalists. They are a martyr for the cause. Let me remind my listeners of the World Central Kitchen incident, where the Hamas terrorists infiltrated World Central Kitchen, put terrorists in the cars, started firing at IDF drones in order to get their attention, and then let those humanitarian aid workers from the West get killed. They set them up to die so they can have a nice report in the media about how Israel killed international aid workers, which, by the way, has since been proven that the World Central Kitchen has fired a whole bunch of their employees for being part of a terrorist organization, even though they claimed that this was all the Israelis' fault initially. It really just goes to show the levels in which Hamas will sacrifice people they don't care about for a headline. So if we see that the Hamas terrorists will purposefully martyr international people for their cause without any hesitation, why do we think they won't do that with international journalists? You don't think they're going to go and take a CNN person hostage or set them up to be killed? Of course they will, because it helps their cause. So this is one main reason why Israel says, look, as bad as it looks on us, we don't want journalists in Gaza because they will be used against us and they might die, unfortunately, thanks to Hamas, who uses them as human shields or sets them up to be killed. And we don't want to deal with that. We'll take the bad press, or whatever you want to call it, about not having journalists in, rather than allowing Hamas to have us kill a journalist accidentally and then get to promote it all over the international media. Another main reason why I think the IDF doesn't let international journalists in is because it really won't make a difference in the story. According to Piers Morgan, he likes to suggest that if there was international media in Gaza, we would have a much more fair and unbiased view of the conflict. All we need is to have these people in, and they'll tell the truth for sure. They will not show you a biased picture. The international media will be 100% accurate and truthful without a doubt, as long as they're in Gaza. I almost couldn't get through that statement without laughing. And I'm sure many of you are probably laughing too, because anybody who's listened to this podcast or watched the news over the last year realizes that the international media, for the most part, has been absolutely brutal in covering the Gaza situation. They have covered up Hamas crimes. They have fully lied about pretty much everything that's going on in Gaza. And I guess, according to Piers Morgan, it's only because they didn't get to see it themselves. There has been countless examples of inside emails and memos and things being put out, for example, from the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, telling the reporters to not use the word terrorist for Hamas or October 7th, and use much softer words in order to make sure we don't paint them with a bad picture, the Hamas terrorists of October 7th. There have been people who have gotten fired for using the wrong terminology, for not towing the party line, the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel line. We used to see on CNN and MSNBC when we did the death count numbers, which were always fake, followed by the according to Gaza Ministry of Health. And then they slowly started taking that out, and now we're back to just saying 50,000 people have died. We've gone back to the flat-out lies that they know are lies. The United Nations has said that those numbers are not accurate, and the United Nations also lies. So this idea that if we only let these international media sources in, we would definitely get the truth and not a biased story that we are already getting. Their biased stories are not because the reporters are not in Gaza. That is a choice that they are making. That is an ideological choice that they make to demonize Israel and to whitewash the Palestinian terrorist groups. They don't exist. They're not there. Everybody's a baby and everybody's a woman. And there is no better example than something that happened last week with the quote-unquote journalists being killed in Gaza. On December 26th, the world media went up in arms about this strike that the IDF did that killed 5 journalists. How disgusting. I've heard this talking point so many times. Meanwhile, when you actually look at the names of these journalists, aka terrorists, every single one of their names shows up on the Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives list. These were legitimate terrorists for Palestinian Islamic Jihad who were in a place they probably shouldn't have been, planning whatever attacks or whatever they were doing, killed. And then, of course, the fake media in Gaza says that every one of them were journalists, and therefore they become journalists. Nobody asks any questions. And just for anybody who might be playing devil's advocate here, where they say, well, who believes the IDF? The IDF is just making it up and claiming they were not journalists and they were terrorists. There are documented lists that Israel has received through their intelligence units, in addition to paperwork on the ground in Gaza that they have found, computer systems, things that they take back to Israel. And all of these men were listed with their names, their ID numbers, their salaries for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So this idea that the world has that, unfortunately, if only we had unbiased people in the area, that this would solve the issue of the unfair coverage of Israel, is living a little bit in a fantasy land. This is not a thing. The anti-Israel coverage is a choice. It is absolutely based on and run cover by the United Nations, UNRWA, Hamas, and all of their supporters. All of them are the ones putting out the info and just watching the international world suck it up and put it out there. It is the American international media that is choosing to not put any asterisks next to the death numbers or saying, by the way, this is unconfirmed. And then whenever they talk about what Israel did, it's always followed by, according to the IDF. So I don't know if we believe them. This is not an accident. This is a conscious choice. So despite Piers Morgan saying if we only let people in, things would be different, we could really trust what we're seeing, he's a little bit off. And Israel has allowed various media sources to go into Gaza on numerous occasions. I have seen different organizations like CNN, MSNBC, other people going into Gaza with, of course, the asterisk beside it saying, we were watched by the IDF at all times. We had to show them our stuff before we put it out. They got to veto anything we saw or didn't see. But the journalists do go in, but Israel has to keep them safe as they can. And the problem is that that's never enough. Whenever Israel puts out information, lets the media go in, there's always an exception. We have to explain and put a little disclaimer beside it. But then whenever they get information from Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and even the United Nations Refugee Organization for Palestine, UNRWA, they take that at face value. It is solid gold truth. Israel is held to an impossible standard. So what's the point in putting international people at risk and causing more damage to the IDF and the view of Israel around the world? For what? For the same unbiased coverage? What is the point, really? What's the point for Israel, anyway? There seems to be no upside to the issue. So for now, we're unfortunately stuck with this current status quo of no journalists being able to go in. The only information that the international world gets, unfortunately, is either from the IDF, which they denounce immediately, and from Hamas, which they accept without question. What honestly amazes me sometimes is how this same international world who uses these quote-unquote journalists in Gaza ignore the reality of who they are helping. It came out not that long after October 7th that many of the quote-unquote reporters and journalists were involved in the attack on October 7th. They went into Israel illegally and they were taking videos and participating in the death of Jews. Many organizations condemned it, said that they didn't support it. Some fired the quote-unquote journalists from their organization and no longer used them. It also came out, clear as day, that one of the hostages that was rescued was being held by a quote-unquote journalist in Rafah. So this journalist was not only being a part of the terrorism, but he was actively writing stories while he was holding a hostage. And it's not like the international companies don't know this. They could find this information. They are reporters after all. But they don't care. That really is not important to them. That their people they are hiring are actively involved in terror. Let's not pretend that these organizations don't realize that there is no open and free press in Gaza. Gaza currently is under control of Hamas, and literally nothing happens in there without Hamas agreeing. There has been incidents of people who have put out messages through their social media, unsanctioned by Hamas, who disappear or who are beaten nearly to death by Hamas soldiers for daring to tell the truth. The only messages that they and you are seeing are the ones that Hamas allows, that Hamas pays for. And believe it or not, Hamas has very strict rules about what they allow to be posted on social media. In 2014, the Middle East Media Research Institute exposed social media guidelines that were issued by Hamas-run Gaza Information Ministry that told their people to label anybody who is seen killed in any of their videos as innocent, even if they are terrorists. They are also told to begin all posts with, quote, "in the response to cruel Israeli attacks," and then fill in the blank, always making sure that Israel is clearly the aggressor in any of their posts. There is never a justification for any terrorist to be killed. One of the most blatant instructions that they are given is to avoid publishing photos or videos of any type of rocket launches in civilian areas. The quote-unquote journalists that are putting out information are told to, quote, paint a picture of the suffering and the civilians in Gaza and the West Bank, while of course ignoring anything Hamas does to them. And one of the most not shocking things that they tell their social media people to do, be wary of disseminating information and pictures of fatalities of the resistance, meaning terrorists. And do not mention details about the circumstances of their deaths as martyrs or where they were killed. This way, Hamas can manipulate that information after the fact. Call them journalists, say they were in a hospital, or just change it and say that they were children playing in a playground. This is the information that the international world is using to report on Gaza. Clearly a very unbiased source, according to Hamas. In the end, this idea that Israel should be allowing international journalists in would be great in an ideal world. In a world where not only would the terrorist groups not use those international people as human shields and as weapons against the Israelis, and also in a world where those international media would actually tell a story that is truthful and is not biased, and that isn't filled with a whole bunch of disclaimers about how Israel wouldn't allow them to tell the truth, or this may not be the full story. The double standard we see here is never going to go away. The reality of this is that they're just anti-Israel groups. We've seen it from their emails between different people at the organizations. We've seen it from higher ups to their reporters. Ironically, no different than the Hamas people telling their reporters what they can and can't say, how they should and shouldn't show things. It's ironic to say that international media operates no differently than a terrorist organization. But as of now, you can see we really can't trust much of what comes out of Gaza. Even if you want to say that Israel's not perfect and Israel's going to tell a slightly skewed story, I can accept that. But to suggest that Hamas and their reporters are somehow more truthful than Israel, by the way, with a free press that will find out if Israel lied about certain things, why do we treat them as equal? And why does the international world only put disclaimers when Israel says something, and then accept the UN, Hamas, Al Jazeera, Qatari state media information without any kind of media disclaimers? So if it was up to me, I would say we should keep the people banned from Gaza. Why sentence these international reporters to death for a cause that none of them really believe in? Why let them become martyrs for a cause that none of them even understand? Because in the end, the coverage is not going to change, whether they're in Gaza or they're just getting their information directly from Hamas. They're still going to be anti-Israel and publishing blatant lies. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next time.